Hello, everybody. James here, and I nearly said story time with Dutch, but it's not. It's WSI with James. And of course, just before we get to my guest, I'm going to plug a couple of my own books before we get to the guests. Owen Hart, King of Pranks, which I wrote, very, very good. And of course, The Rock, the People's Champion, Dwayne The Rock Johnson, both available on Amazon. You know the deal. The links are in the description. But for now, and I'm actually going to have to read this out because it's quite a long intro, I want to introduce former executive of WWE, TNA, and WCW, co-author, along with Guy Evans, of the Nitro book, of his second biography, Grateful, which is available now. And I also recently discovered he is a former WCW Hardcore champion, which I only found out that today. It is the man with the most famous cheekbones in wrestling. It's Eric Bischoff. Hello.
Hello, how are you, James? Great to be with you.
Oh, I nearly balls that intro up about 5 times then, but I managed to plow my way through.
No, I love those good intros because it makes me feel better about myself. So this is kind of like therapy, whenever I do a show like this and the host is gracious enough to give me a big build up, it reminds me that I actually have done something in my life.
Hardcore champion. I
Hardcore
don't
champion.
remember this, and I'll guarantee I watched it because we used to get an I don't know if you were gone by this time in 1999, where we got Worldwide. We got a 1-hour version of Worldwide on Channel 5, which was terrestrial television rather than cable. And I don't know how the views did or anything, but I remember watching that every single week. It was 6 weeks behind, and it had special. It always seemed to have special commentary by Larry Zbyszko and Juventud Guerrera.
That's weird. I didn't even know who we could do commentary. That's weird.
Yeah, he only, like, the English he could do, it was all insider references where he'd say, here is the jobber of the week, and then it'd go to the match.
Compelling entertainment, I'm sure.
Yes, it was one way to put it, that intro. You've been over to the UK quite a number of times, and I like to ask people who've come over to our Fair Isle quite a few times, if you've got any specific memories of working capacity being over in the UK, any memorable stories?
Nothing really outstanding. What people sometimes don't realize is, for example, when I went over to the UK with WWE, our schedule is so tight and is so structured that there's very little time to get out and explore and see the sights and enjoy, wherever we are. We go over and we'd see the inside of the aircraft. Then you see the inside of a bus that would take you to the hotel, and then you go from the hotel to the arena, and then you just reverse that process again and do it all over again. So there's very little time, to do much. But I have gone over to the UK, for example, with TNA. I've gone over to the UK on my own, with different promoters. Kenny McIntosh is a promoter that has brought me over to the UK. And on those trips, I make sure that I schedule enough time on the front end once I arrive, and I spend enough time on the back end after I arrive and after my event is over to just walk about, and explore on my own. I just like to be by myself, and I like to explore, the pubs, and the older ones, because I love history.
Mm.
For me, living in the United States, when we see an establishment that's 80 years old or 100 years old, it's like, oh man, that's an historic, business, or that's in a historic building. Whereas we go over to the UK and you can find buildings and churches and pubs that, been there since the 1600s. And I'm, I get, I don't want to say overwhelmed, but I'm so aware of that. And it makes me think so much about history and the people that were there before us. And it makes me wonder what their lives were like. So I love being in an area like in the UK, where you guys probably take that all for granted because you see it every day. But and I love to go into a little local pub where nobody recognizes me. There's no wrestling fans. Usually it's older people in that pub. And you strike up a conversation and you get to know them. And that's how I learn about the different areas that I'm in, is by talking to locals. And I really enjoy that. And good curry. I love good curry. So I go curry hunting.
Man, well, I've got recommendations for you forever in Manchester. But it's funny that you bring up the pubs, and yes, you're right. We do take them for granted to a point, but in the last 10 years or so, with alcohol tax being so high, pubs have been shutting more and more. And it's a sad state of affairs because two pubs that I know have been open since the 1800s, just at the end of my road. One was a scam. Essentially, as you would say, the real estate agent. A real estate agent bought the pub, and then wouldn't you know who won the pony? I suppose cornetism. It burnt down a few weeks later, and flats, apartments were built on it. And then the same thing with the council round here. Another pub's just been bought. That's going to have like a 5-story high rise of flats as well. It's just, that's 200 years of history wiped out.
It is, and that history creates, I don't want to go too far into this, but I think there's an energy, a vibration that's created in communities that have been around. And it's like those buildings have souls and they have their own stories. And whether you're tuned into that or not, it's still there. And that's what gives, I love Manchester, by the way. Manchester's a blue collar town. It reminds me of where I grew up, and I just hate seeing that history disappearing. And the same thing happens here in the States where people come in. We call it gentrifying.
Yeah.
But there's areas of Chicago, for example, that are disappearing, and they have so much positive energy, and I hate to see that. I guess that's progress, right?
Irreplaceable. Turns out can be. I mean, the buildings can be replaced, but the history behind it cannot be replaced. And I have a real aversion to quote unquote updating and making things better in that sense.
Do I. That's why I live where I live. I live in a little town outside of Yellowstone National Park in the Rocky Mountains, and the town is called Cody, Wyoming. And Buffalo Bill Cody founded this town. And by the way, Buffalo Bill Cody has quite the connection to the UK. Buffalo Bill Cody brought his Wild West show to the UK back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And the Queen of England was so impressed with Buffalo Bill Cody that she sent a cherrywood bar that is probably, I don't know in meters, but it's probably about 60 or 70 foot wide and very tall, and it's all hand carved.
I play golf, so it's all feet and yards to me, man. So don't worry.
All right, good. Well, that cherrywood bar is still to this day in the hotel that Buffalo Bill Cody built in the early 1909. So that history there again, man, it's history. And I go into that restaurant where the bar is, and I sit and look at it sometimes and just think about, Buffalo Bill Cody went over there and he brought, this incredible part of American history, brought it in the form of a live show, live entertainment, where he brought the horses, he brought the Native Americans that were part of his show, famous Native Americans that at one point he was at war with. But after that was all over, he brought them and he put on the spectacular Wild West show. And it toured all over the world. It toured the UK, it toured France, various countries. So, yeah, I don't know why we're talking about that, but that's where I live. And I choose to live here because of that history and the culture that comes with it.
We're talking about it because it's interesting. I know everyone else is like crying out for some wrestling questions, but I'll say this one thing is that one thing I love to see, and one day I hope to start getting into collecting, are vintage posters. And I love the old circus posters of, the late 1800s, early 1900s and that kind of thing. And those, the cowboy shows and that kind of thing. I just think the art on those posters are fantastic, and you feel yourself being there. Anyway, I'm boring everyone to death, I'm sure, with non-wrestling talk. Has there been any wrestling news out there in the last week or so recently? I can't think.
No, I think it's been pretty quiet, hasn't it?
I saw on the YouTube channel, 83 Weeks, that you've done an entire episode on Vince returning and Stephanie leaving, and potentially at this point Saudi Arabia buying, or the Crown Prince and the fund buying WWE. What's sort of your bottom line on what you make of this entire situation? That's basically a real life entourage now.
Yeah, it's it's a fascinating time in professional wrestling, for sure in professional wrestling, but I think even in media as a whole. Here in this country, at least, we call it vertical integration. And what that basically means is bigger companies buying up smaller companies. And before you know it, there's only 2 or 3 companies left. Instead of having all these independent production companies and independent, cable outlets and networks and such, it all kind of gets gobbled up and aggregated under one brand. And I think that's sad, much like we were talking about with the destruction of old buildings with history and class and character of their own. When you have this vertical integration that's fueled by mergers and acquisitions, a lot of the independent television producers, a lot of the independent television networks, they lose their soul and they become one big corporate entity. And it manifests with less variety, less character. I find the end result can be very, very boring and sanitized. So I'm sorry. In many ways, I'm sad to see WWE being sold to a bigger conglomerate, whether it be NBC or Comcast USA here or the Fox, empire, because I love the independent nature of what WWE has been for so long. It's been a family business. It's a public company, but it's still run by one guy. And I'm going to miss that. But there's so much speculation going on. The Saudi thing, I was convinced as late as Monday night before I went to bed, because of the people that I was hearing from that have credibility, that it was a done deal. And I was very disappointed to hear that, because I think, take the politics of all of it, and I put that aside because it's a separate issue. But I felt like we're losing something. We're losing a part of something that is so uniquely American. And I was grateful and relieved to hear that doesn't look like it's, at least right now, like it's really the Saudis that are in a position to close the deal anytime soon. So hopefully, it'll go somewhere else, but we'll see. Time will tell.
What do you think? You worked with Vince closely at 2019, if no other time. What do you think Vince's end game here is? Because he's got more money than he could ever spend in his life already. He's already 77 years old, and apparently he's very bored staying at home. So what's the end game for Vince? Does he just want power? Does he really want to sell? What do you think?
James, if I knew the answer to that question, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. I would be sitting with a stockbroker and planning my investment strategies. That's the wild card in this thing, James, because, and I've said this a lot in other interviews, I competed against Vince McMahon for a long time. And you get to know somebody, or you get a perception of someone when you're actually in the trenches fighting against them. And then I went to work for Vince McMahon back in the early 2000s, but as a talent. Now, as a talent, I would talk to Vince, or in some cases when we would have scenes together on television, obviously I'm working with Vince and things like that. And I got to know Vince a little bit during that period of time. And then when I worked back in 2019, when I was an executive working underneath Vince, and I reported directly to Vince, he was my direct boss. And I probably spent a total of 20 hours a week, maybe 25 hours a week with Vince, either one-on-one or most often in a very small group of people. Paul Heyman, for example, Bruce Prichard. And I got a little bit of insight into what makes Vince tick. But I have to say, he is one of the most complex and fascinating people I've ever worked with or against. And I don't know what his motivation is. That's the key to this whole thing. There's two schools of thought, right? One school of thought suggests to me that just take Vince McMahon at face value. You take his press release at face value. He's coming back to maximize the media rights opportunity or maximize the facilitation of a sale. Now, if you take that at face value, it suggests to me, having known Vince a little bit, that Vince has decided this is his company. He built it from the ground up. Well, not from the ground up. He actually, bought it from his father. But the WWE that we know today is essentially a company that's been built from the ground up. And he wants to write the last chapter of his story. And he wants to be the one to put the period at the end of the last sentence in his legacy as a guy who came in and made one of the biggest media deals in history. That's one school of thought. There's another school of thought that suggests that all of this is about Vince gaining a little bit of revenge, because let's face it, it was a palace coup of sorts that forced him out. We don't know the details of that. I think a lot of that is going to be revealed in the weeks and months to come. There is a lot more to the story of Vince McMahon resigning than we currently know. I've heard the rumors. I know what the chatter is. I wouldn't dare repeat it because I don't know if it's true or not, and I don't do that. But regardless, Vince was forced out the door. That is antithetical to Vince McMahon's genetic makeup. He will fight. And that school of thought would suggest that Vince McMahon forced his way back to the board and is going to do what he needs to do, which includes probably selling the company, but ultimately with him in charge of that new entity, right?
Yeah.
So, and I don't know which is true. I don't know what his motivation is. No, I don't think anybody does, by the way, other than Vince McMahon.
You're uniquely qualified. I mean, the last major wrestling promotion that was sold, obviously for a different number and for different reasons, was, of course, WCW. And you were going to buy it Fusion. Is it Fusion Media? Anyway, it was you and some investors. I'm going to blow the name if I say it a third time. And something I would really like to know is, why did you do the press release first saying that you bought it and then it was taken away at the last second?
Well, for multiple reasons. One is, if we had not done a press release, see, there was a period of time when we started negotiations, and you have to go through the due diligence. You have to, the process of acquiring a company like WCW from Turner Broadcasting, which was a publicly held company. The due diligence in the process is slow. It takes time. And we knew that during that due diligence period, inevitably, the story was going to leak. It would have become apparent, and there would have been news stories all over, most of them not accurate, most of them harmful to the process. And it would have created a lot of anxiety amongst people in WCW because they wouldn't know what was true and what was not true. So the decision was made once we had a signed letter of intent, once we knew that that due diligence period was going to actually begin. We felt that it was important that we be honest with the public and we frame the news and the information accurately and clearly, so that the rumors and the innuendo and the chatter wouldn't drive the information, that we would drive the information.
The other question, I was desperately trying to search in my head what it was, and I've just seen it here, is how long after WCW was actually sold to Vince McMahon, there were certain people who didn't believe that the sale had gone through. And I think it took, were there certain people within the company who it took weeks for it to register that WCW was sold?
Oh, I don't know. I wasn't there, right?
No.
I was gone by that point in time. So I can't tell you, what the general feeling was inside of WCW. I know that with people that I was close to in WCW that I worked with regularly, they knew it was real, and they were devastated. Part of it was because they didn't know how it was going to affect their life, and that's human nature. Anyone would feel that way. But for example, guys like David Crockett. David Crockett, was part of the Jim Crockett Promotions. That was his family's promotion that Ted Turner acquired out of bankruptcy, and then brought in and renamed it WCW. But David Crockett came along with that, and so did David's brother Jackie Crockett, who was the cameraman.
Yeah, the cameraman, yeah.
And guys like David and Jackie Crockett, it wasn't just a transaction; it was part of their lives, and they had deep history and a deep relationship with, obviously, Jim Crockett Promotions, and as a result, WCW. So I think when it was sold, my impression is that they felt a real sense of loss, personal loss, not just because of their job or their income, but something deeper than that.
From here, I think I'm going to do a little game with you. I'm going to give you a bit of a I say rapid fire. Sometimes I say rapid fire. I ask one question, I get a 10-minute answer. So it's entirely whatever length answer you want to give me. It's name association. You cannot say yourself any promotion. I'm going to give you a sentence, a description, and you tell me who best fits it. And if there's a tiny story to go along with it, please share it. And the first one is funniest person in the locker room. Any locker room.
Ernest Miller was always a funny guy and was always laughing and joking. And you know what I love about Ernest is whenever he's having fun and joking around with people, he reminds me so much of Muhammad Ali. When Muhammad Ali would come out, and he'd start saying poems and joking and laughing with people and teasing the media and playing with Howard Cosell.
Mm-hmm.
There was such a fun vibe about Muhammad Ali. And if I close my eyes and I listen, I had Ernest come out. Ernest and his wife came to visit us out here in Wyoming 2 years ago. And he is so much fun to be around. He brings joy to the locker room, or he did. And I would say Ernest Miller for me, personally.
I've got his number as well, and I never booked an interview with him. I've got to do it. Remind me, everybody watching.
He's he's a really smart, fascinating guy. You'll enjoy talking to him.
Last man standing at the bar.
Oh, that's Ric Flair. Are you kidding me? And there's way too many stories.
Yes.
I can't even remember them all. I'd have to catalog them like information in a library.
Most beautiful woman wrestler, valet, whatever it might be, in real life.
Tori Wilson.
Right answer.
And you know what? Tori is not only beautiful on the outside. Tori is a really, really beautiful person on the inside, which just makes that such an easy choice for me.
Yeah. Smelliest wrestler.
That's a toss-up. That's either Mick Foley or Van Vader. Now, I say that because back in the early days of WCW, when I was an announcer, right, I would get these guys, when they were backstage getting ready for a match, or I get them after a match, and they'd been on the road for 3 or 4 days. And it's not that they were smelly as individuals, but their gear just reeked.
Like the leather masks and stuff that you can't wash.
The leather mask and just all of it, the elbow pads and the knee pads. It was just horrible. And to top it off, now not Mick Foley, but a lot of the guys used this stuff. It was called hot stuff. It was like an oil that kind of accentuated their musculature, and and it made them shine under the camera, so it looked like they were perspiring, and it's just, and they would all use that stuff, and it was just the smell. It's not that the smell was so bad, but it was so powerful. So when you combine that smell with the smell of their 3-week-old gear that hadn't seen the inside of a washing machine, it was sometimes tough. I'd be standing doing an interview and my eyes were watering.
You just slowly backing off with the microphone.
People thought I was crying, and I was very emotional trying to ask somebody a question. And it wasn't that. It was the hot stuff that was saturating me.
Now, this is one that I'm really fascinated for your take on, especially. Biggest stooge for the dirt sheets. You have a name, don't you?
Yeah, I do, but I'm not going there. I don't want to. That's negative, man.
No,
I try to stay away from.
no, absolutely. Most in trouble with The Office.
Uh, eh, I'd have to go probably Ric Flair again. And it was never anything serious, but I mean, it escalated to one point where, Rick was very public about his feelings about me and how he was being treated. And it was in the local newspapers in Atlanta. And I ended up having to kind of defend myself in WCW and ended up threatening to sue him. And it escalated to a point where it was just out of control and so unfortunate. Um, that was the most serious it ever got. But beyond that, it was all just it's almost funny stuff, not anything serious, but it seems like Rick was always, a part of the conversation in the office.
Was it something like he was turning up late, or like the smaller things rather than?
Oh no, all small things. Yeah, that's what I mean. It was almost funny.
Let me see. I've got so many of these. The worst piece of merchandise that you signed off on as part of WCW or maybe even TNA.
Yeah, I didn't sign off on merchandise. I'm what they call a macro manager as opposed to a micro manager, and I put the right people in place and I give them all the latitude they need to do their job or fail at it, and then I replace them. And there was a couple pieces of merchandise that indicated to me, especially now, that I should have fired those people.
Any, maybe not the person who signed off on it, but any pieces of merch that you remember looking at?
I think the logo. I think the logo that we ended up creating, I think in 1998 or 1999, I refer to it as the cat's ass logo, because if you look at that thing, and squint your eyes a little bit, it looks just like a cat that's walking away from me when his tail's up in the air. It looks just like a cat's ass. That was horrible. And I wish I would have never let that happen. Every time I see that logo on a t-shirt or anything, it just makes me cringe.
I'm so pleased you brought up that logo, because that was actually one of my future questions. Most of the questions are related to the book, Grateful. And that was one I just had to ask. I mentioned this to Kevin Sullivan and said, whose idea was making the logo? And I refer to it as the Starship Enterprise logo. I've seen other people refer to it as the big silver vagina logo. Where did the sort of genesis of like changing the sets come from and changing the logo?
It all started with marketing. And we had a VP of marketing by the name of Jay Hassman. Now, it's kind of a long story, which you'll probably get used to when you interview me. But about 1997, early 1998, my boss then, his name was Harvey Schiller. He was the president of TBS Sports, Turner Sports, came to me and said, Eric, you pretty much run everything in this company. And you're involved in every aspect of it. You need to delegate more. And I couldn't resist that, because he was my boss. And I knew deep down inside, I knew he was right. I needed to learn how to delegate to people that I didn't have a relationship with. It was easy for me. There were certain people that I really trusted, and those were the people that I would kind of let do their thing until they didn't. But I needed to learn, because the company was growing so fast, I needed to learn to delegate more. So my first attempt at that was allowing my VP of legal, whose name was Nick Lambros. And Nick was a great guy. I really miss him. And I enjoyed working with him, even though he was an attorney. I don't usually like working with attorneys. But I really enjoyed working with him. And I let him oversee marketing. So instead of marketing reporting to me, marketing reported to Nick. And I let it go. I had to. And they came back to me and said, we think we need a new, fresher logo, which was a huge mistake in retrospect, huge mistake, because that logo that we had, that Nitro logo, was so powerful. But we needed a WCW logo. So anyway, fast forward, Nick and Jay Hassman. Nick hired Jay Hassman, and Nick and Jay sat down and they put together all these different ideas, and they settled on the cat's ass logo or the silver vagina logo, whatever you want to call it. They settled on that one. And my first reaction was like, it doesn't say anything. You got to squint and look really hard to find the WCW brand. But if I would have shut that down, I would have been doing exactly the opposite of what my boss, Harvard Schiller, wanted me to do. So I reluctantly went, if that's the consensus, if that's what you all think, then go for it. And I wish I wouldn't have done that. I wish I would have gone to Harvey and said, Harvey, you wanted me to delegate, and this is the shit that they came up with. Wouldn't it be better if I just did it myself? So, yeah, there's that story.
Do you know, I told this, for what it's worth, I told Kevin Sullivan the same thing. And when the logo was changed, the set was changed. And the set was nothing but black and white, or black and silver. And it sort of sucked the colour out of the broadcast, if you know what I mean, a little bit. And I remember thinking that vividly as like a 13-year-old when I was watching it. But there was one bit of sort of like a silver lining to the new logo, is that the ramp then had a bit of the logo on it, and I kept seeing wrestlers slip and fall over on it, which was brilliant.
Yeah, there's a lot that went wrong there for sure. And that's an example of what happened when a company grows too fast. If you look at WCW and its history, when I took over WCW in 1994, essentially, I was made the executive producer in 1993, and I had control over the television product. I had no control over creative. I had no control over talent. I wasn't involved in any of the talent hiring or firing or any of that. But by 1994, I started getting more and more influence and ultimately control. I was named president of the company at some point. One of the casualties of growing too fast is you don't really have the infrastructure and a seasoned team that are handling these things and growing along with you in a calculated way over a period of time. You end up with people that are very energetic and well-intentioned, but there's no cohesion. It's just, everything is random. You got this department over here, trying hard as they can to keep up with the success and the growth of the company, and they're making decisions every single day. And you got these people over here making decisions in their department, and there's very little real communication going on. That's typical. That's not unusual for any business when you grow too fast. There's a real risk of success, and when success happens in a very, very short period of time, as it did with WCW. You go back when I took over the company in 1993 or 1994 or 93, when I was made executive producer. I didn't really take over the company, but I was put in that position. WCW their gross revenues were $24 million a year, and they were losing $10 million a year in the process. By 1998, we were generating $350 million in revenue, and our profits, depending on whose accounting you really want to listen to, were somewhere between $50 and $80 million. Now, that all occurred in a 3 to 4 year window, and most of that growth occurred over a 24-month period. And with all of that growth and success, you have to have a foundation of logistical support and structural support in the individuals that are capable of keeping up with that success. That was a problem, because we grew so fast that it overwhelmed a lot of the people that just weren't used to that kind of success and that kind of pressure and growth.
And also, when you took over in 93, you basically 1 or 2 years older than I am now. And I can't imagine, because I'm 36 now. And I think, what are you, 37, 38? And it's just like, what an amount of responsibility to have.
Yeah, it was a fun time though, man.
Yeah.
I'm glad I went through it. I wouldn't want to do it again, but I'm glad I experienced it then.
I'll give you a few more of these. Not that rapid fire, to be honest, but they're all good questions and all good answers. The worst gimmick ever.
Boy, that's tough. There've been a lot of them.
Yeah.
I say Oz, Kevin Nash and Oz. That was about as stupid as it gets.
The most dangerous fan attack. Because with WCW, I always associate fans jumping in the ring more to attack the wrestlers more than WWF at the equivalent time.
That never worked out too well for anybody that tried it. Usually that, when a fan would jump over the rail and get into the ring, that was kind of like open season for the wrestlers. And what it never ceased to amaze me is, when you're a fan and you jump over that rail and then you have to crawl up into that ring, there is a period of time where you are so physically exposed and vulnerable to just getting your teeth kicked down your throat, because you can't even, you're trying to crawl through the ropes or get up onto the ring apron. And while you're doing that, you've got guys that are, kicking the hell out of you. I never understood why people did that other than just seeking attention, I guess. But, I can't say I can pick a worse one because they all ended up bad for whoever did it.
Let me see what else we've got here. The most memorable thing you saw on an airplane?
A woman masturbating. Yeah. I was coming back from, I don't know where I was, somewhere on the West Coast. Might have been San Francisco, actually. And I was it was over a holiday season. I think it was right after New Year's Eve. And it was a crowded plane. And I was sitting in coach because first class was full. And I'm sitting in about the middle of the plane. I'm on the aisle seat. And, on planes, you're not really directly across the aisle from somebody. You're usually staggered just a little bit. So, I'm on the plane and decided to stretch my neck out a little bit. I go to stretch and I look, and there's this woman, and she was actually fairly attractive. I was shocked. Probably in her mid-40s. And she's looking right at me. I mean, looking directly at me and just going to town. The guy next to her, I don't know if it was her husband or boyfriend, he's smiling, he's looking at me, he's looking at her, he's watching the show. And this went on and on and on. And it wasn't like late night where she was hoping everybody was asleep. It was like 11 o'clock in the morning. It was the craziest thing I've ever seen.
And that was in coach as well, not even in business. Amazing.
That was in coach. Yeah.
Man, that's kind of...
On a completely full plane. Like, it wasn't like she had a little bit of privacy and just had to rub one off and, release some tension. This was just like she was putting on a show for the entire plane.
Man, she wasn't even a nervous passenger. Yeah, I was thinking that's the kind of service you'd expect in first class. But
yeah, I don't know if she was waiting for a round of applause when she was finished or what. But...
yeah, don't shake hands with her afterwards, so you won't.
No,
anyway.
No.
Right, I'll give you a couple more, then we'll move on. The best celebrity that you ever worked with within the wrestling business?
I really enjoyed working with Dennis Rodman. People have strong opinions about him based on their perception of what they see. Dennis is a very intelligent, he's a deep individual. When he's complicated and he's shy, which is one of the things I think that one of the reasons why, you see this outward purple hair, yellow hair, the jewelry, the tattoos, showing up in a wedding dress at a book signing, all these really over the top things that we know about Dennis publicly. But the private Dennis is a very shy person. When he's not in that gregarious kind of Dennis Rodman mode, when it's just by himself, one-on-one, he's typically very shy. But once you get to know Dennis and he's comfortable with you and you engage in a conversation, it's actually a real conversation and not just superficial bullshit. What a very intelligent, very sensitive, very generous guy. And I enjoyed working with him. The other one, though, I guess the most meaningful celebrity I've ever worked with was Muhammad Ali.
Yeah.
Just a highlight of my career was the time that I got to spend one-on-one with Muhammad Ali going over to Pyongyang, North Korea. I really got to know Muhammad, and I can, without reservation, say we became friends. And I illustrated by, after that trip to Pyongyang, North Korea, a couple of years later, I brought my family over to Tokyo for my kids were very young at the time. My son was maybe 12 or 13 years old, 14. My daughter was 2 years younger than that. And my wife was there with me. We went over to the Tokyo Dome for a big New Japan Pro Wrestling New Year's Eve show. That was the biggest show of the year for them in the Tokyo Dome. And unbeknownst to me, Muhammad Ali was invited to be at that event as well as I was. And I was back in the green room before the event, socializing. There was a lot of people there. And Muhammad called me over to sit down and talk to him. And in that conversation, I'll break down and start crying when I tell this story. I try not to tell it too often because it embarrasses me. But I'm talking to Muhammad Ali, and he said, he wanted to know, he said, Eric, did you watch the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, 96 Olympics? I said, well, of course I did. He said, do you think I embarrassed myself? Because if you go back and look at that, his Parkinson's disease was such that his hand was very, very, it was obvious he was suffering from Parkinson's. And he asked me my opinion if I thought he embarrassed himself. Yeah, that.
I mean, I believe he was he in the London 2012 Olympics as well? And it was so great for him to be there, even though he was like really in the end stages of Parkinson's. But I think he was sort of sat on a chair at the end, and it's like, it's great that he's still there to see. He's one of the few people maybe on earth that it's just fantastic to see. Still
yeah, and Muhammad,
there.
While we were with him, I sat next to Muhammad on the plane going from Tokyo to Pyongyang. It was about a 2-hour flight or a 3-hour flight. And I sat next to him, and Muhammad could still, but he had to whisper. Like, he couldn't project, but he could whisper, and you could understand him very easily. But he was telling me jokes, and he also told me the story about how he became Cassius Clay, the character. Because Muhammad Ali used to go in Louisville, used to go to the wrestling matches, and he was a big fan of Gorgeous George and loved the way Gorgeous George, got the crowd fired up, and they couldn't wait to see him get beat. Gorgeous George was a heel back then, right? And Muhammad Ali told me that he based that very loud, gregarious, over-the-top character of Cassius Clay before he became Muhammad Ali. He based that on Gorgeous George. And I heard that story directly from Muhammad Ali himself because he had to, whispering it in my ear. And I remember as it was happening, I'm thinking, I am the luckiest guy in the world. I mean, Muhammad Ali, even then, he was an icon. He was different than just a great athlete. He was a very, very special human being. And I just realized in that moment how lucky I was to be the guy sitting next to him hearing that story.
I will ask you two more. The longest you hired somebody that you forgot were on the books and you were still paying?
Oh, I couldn't tell you.
Okay.
See, what people don't realize is I didn't hire everybody. Everybody thinks because I was president of the company that I made every single decision that took place in WCW. That's just not true. I'm sure there were people on the roster in WWE that, Vince didn't even know they were on the roster. I'm sure, well, Tony Khan, I mean, there's probably there's probably people on that roster that he forgot he hired. Currently in the witness protection program. You go to AEW and you're never heard from again. Nobody knows what happened to you.
I'll give you one more then. The most memorable backstage fight.
I never saw one.
Really?
They always occurred, they occurred when I wasn't around. I heard about a lot of them. When Paul Orndorff, dropped Van Vader, I was on my way to the building and I missed that.
You're the only person in the world that I've interviewed who didn't see it, apparently, because everybody else I've interviewed has claimed they were there in the locker room that day.
Well, and they might have been because it was a television taping and it was in a small, area where everybody was, it was hard not to see anything else that was going on around you because it was such a small backstage area. I didn't see it. I was on my way to the building and I got a call from my assistant, Janie Engel. She was very close to Paul. They were very, very good friends. And she was afraid that I would fire him. So because I had a very close relationship with Janie. I trusted her very much. She was involved in, some of the most, intimate aspects of WCW and what was going on. And I trusted her as a result. And Janie called me on my phone. I'm on my way. And she told me what happened. And she made sure I knew that Vader was kind of started it so that I didn't overreact. And I got to the building, talked to a couple people that did see it and that I trusted. They told me what happened, and I gave Paul Orndorff a raise. Not only did I not fire him, I gave him a raise.
Why have I never heard the punchline to that before? Fantastic. Right then, we're actually going to start referring to the book now after all this. And one of the things that stood out to me about the book, Grateful, Eric Bischoff and Guy Evans, of course. Don't worry, I'll be putting the graphics on constantly. And you talk about Hulk Hogan a lot in the book, and I feel actually quite bad, actually, because you're talking about, after the divorce starts happening with Hulk Hogan, he's in a very, very bad place. And as someone just watching Hulk Hogan as an entity on TV, as a larger-than-life superhero, it took me maybe a few pages to maybe get the sympathy I should have had for Hogan, because he's such a superhero that you sort of forget that he's a real person in that sense as well. But I mean, do you know what? Yeah, I mean, take it from there, I suppose.
Yeah, that's we all experience, anybody that's ever been a fairly high profile character in the wrestling business, we all experience that in one way, shape, or form. And because people have a hard time separating the character from the real person, and it's different, for movie stars, when you meet Tom Cruise, you understand that he doesn't really know how to fly a fighter jet, right? He's 5'6", about 140 pounds, and he's not the guy that you see on Mission Impossible. But you can distinguish it because as culturally and growing up, these are actors playing a role. But wrestling has always kind of blurred those lines, right? Wrestling characters, not so much as now, but in the past would always live their characters in public. That's where one of the things that kayfabe was about. If you were a wrestler back in the 70s, even into the 80s, if you were a wrestler and I'm a wrestler and you're the heel and I'm the babyface, if I walked into a restaurant and I saw you in that restaurant, I'd turn around and walk out. That's how you protected the business. And you kept the audience and the public in a constant state of not being sure if it's real or not. Being able to achieve that state of mind amongst the audience where, yeah, I know it's all entertainment, but these two guys really do hate each other. Like if you can get them to slip into that gray area of not knowing what's real and what's not real, that's the magic of professional wrestling. It's not unlike a professional magician. When you go to a magic show, this guy is not some wizard or some satanic creature or somebody from, the heavens that's able to do magic. It's a show, but you can't figure it out. And when magic is really good, you forget that it's a show and you think that this guy is really creating magic. And that's the magic of professional wrestling. So as a result of that, and the way that manifests is people, I'll use myself as an example. I played an evil, arrogant, just maniacal boss, manipulative boss, right? And people still have that perception of me to this day. That's what they grew up watching. People watch, they know the Mr. McMahon character. Now, granted, the Vince McMahon character and the Mr. McMahon character, while they're two different people, there are some parallels and similarities, as there were with me, which makes it even harder for the audience to distinguish. But when you talk about Hulk Hogan, here's a guy who was at the top of the industry for so long. He was an icon. He changed professional wrestling during his era to become much more mainstream, on the cover of Sports Illustrated, in movie, all the things that back then in the 80s were mind-boggling. Now we take it for granted. Rock's the highest paid movie star in the world. Now we take that for granted. But back then when Hogan did it first, Not that he was the highest paid actor in the world ever, but he broke through that mainstream barrier where the mainstream media no longer looked at professional wrestling the same way they looked at porn, because that's the way people felt about wrestling back in the day.
Like a sort of brown paper bag sort of thing.
Yeah,
You discuss
yeah,
it like that,
you'd watch it, but you wouldn't tell anybody you watched it, right? And if you did, it was like, oh, I just, it's like Playboy. I only read it for the stories. Right. Okay. But with Hulk, because he had been there for so long, and jealousy, envy, resentment, a lot of people that worked with Hulk over the years that didn't get the accolades that Hulk did or get the opportunities that Hulk did. That's where it all starts, right? There's always somebody willing to tear you down. And sometimes there were people that were the closest to you that you would least expect. And then you get the media narratives. For whatever reason, a guy like Dave Meltzer just hated Hulk Hogan because he couldn't go out there and put on a 5-star Japanese style match. He just hated the fact that Hulk Hogan was Hulk Hogan. And the peripheral media starts to create this negative narrative about a guy like Hulk Hogan. And before you know it, over the course of time, and in Hulk's case, 10, 15, 20, 30 years of that, all of a sudden there's a narrative about who Hulk Hogan is. And it's the farthest thing from the truth. Hulk Hogan is one of the kindest, most generous, and I'm not just talking about financially, although that too, but he cares about people, and I saw that early on when I first met him. And it became apparent to me with the little things. I always judge people by how they treat people that can't possibly benefit them, right? If I see somebody, being extra kind and cordial and, going out of their way to be a great person and great energy, but they're doing it with somebody that they're trying to get something from, that says nothing to me about that person. Actually, it does, but not really. But when I see somebody like Hulk Hogan, who in the middle of a meal, while he's engaged in an important conversation, and somebody comes up to him and says, and I've heard this a million times, "Hey, Hulk, I hate to interrupt, but," and Hulk Hogan, over the decades that I've worked with Hulk and been in private situations with him, public situations with him, I've never seen him do anything other than make that person feel good. That doesn't benefit Hulk Hogan, but he cares. And that's one of the things that impressed me most about Hulk Hogan, is the way he treated people who couldn't benefit him in any way, shape, or form. But most people don't know that about him. Now, is he a flawed person? Has he made some really fucked up mistakes? Of course he has. So have I, so have you, and so has everybody that's so critical of him. We don't want to look at our own lives and our own biases and our own mistakes and our own tendency to be judgmental or whatever. We all have flaws. And Hulk, in one of the most vulnerable times of his life, when he was physically in so much pain, he was being medicated like a horse. His doctors were giving him medication that would probably have killed most people. But that's how severe that pain was for him, his back issues. Oh, and let's add on top of that his wife was divorcing him. He was losing his wife. He was losing his home. He was losing his identity as Hulk Hogan. And he was self-medicating on top of the medication that he absolutely needed, by the way. I was there. I saw it. It sometimes brought tears to my eyes when I would see him struggle even to get in and out of a vehicle. It would take him 10 minutes just to get his legs out and be able to stand up so that he could walk to a meeting. Whew. People never saw that. And when you take all of that medication that it was necessary for him, and then he was self-medicating on top of that. He would sit down and go through a quart of vodka between 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 8 o'clock at night on top of the medication. And yeah, in that period of time, he had a lapse in judgment and said things that aren't a reflection of who Hulk Hogan is at all. They're a reflection of a broken, overly medicated, alcohol fueled, desperate person at the lowest point in his life. And of all the critics that were so vociferous in their criticism of Hulk Hogan, I would like them to ask themselves what they think they would be like in that situation. But people don't know what he's really like. So, I mean, some do, some people do, and they love him for it. But, the media narrative and the dirt sheets and the Dave Meltzers of the world have no idea what kind of person. The CM Punk. It's one of the reasons I was so down on CM Punk when he made his comeback, because in his very first promo, he had to reach into his bag of cheap heat and try to get over by burying Hulk Hogan. By the way, a guy he's never worked with and has never met and doesn't know.
I never outdrew, let me tell you.
What kind of asshole are you? And how little confidence in your own abilities do you have to try to get your heat and try to get over by burying someone you don't even know?
One more point about the book with Hulk Hogan is you say that Hulk Hogan forget Hulk Hogan, Terry, trusted you so much when he was going through the divorce. He put all his assets and all his money into your accounts and in your name to sort of save as much as he could through divorce proceedings. Do you remember how much it was, or is that just between you and Terry?
No, and I did say that, and it is true, but there's more to it than that. I was working closely with Terry's financial advisor and lawyers as they were trying to structure Terry's finances in such a way that, knowing that a divorce was coming, to be able to protect as much of his assets as he could. And part of that was to create an LLC, which is a legal organization. It's like a corporation of sorts that those assets would go into. And while Terry had the majority of shares and stock in that, I had actual control over it. And a lot of that had more to do with his trademarks as much as it had to do with property and money. And the honest answer is I don't know, because his finance team, his legal team, and his accounting team were the ones that created that architecture. I had the ability. I mean, if I wanted to be a criminal, I could have entered into all kinds of licensing and trademark deals that would have benefited me. I could have probably, liquidated assets, I guess, in some way, shape, or form. But it was created to be a temporary situation and a bridge of sorts until Terry's legal situation with regard to his divorce was finalized. So it sounds like, he put $20 million in my checking account or something like that. It wasn't quite like that. It was more complicated than that. But the element of trust was at the nucleus of that. Terry needed to have somebody that he could trust and rely upon to help him facilitate some of the things that he needed to do.
Righto then. So I'm going to start bringing up TNA, and you dedicate quite a lot of the book. Grateful. I will keep mentioning the book because that's why we're here, to plug the book as well. And the one thing that I was so pleased that you mentioned is the name TNA. How do you feel about the name TNA?
It's the most juvenile. It was so juvenile, and I think it was a reflection on the people involved at the time that really had no clue what they were doing. They might have, it's one thing to have a lot of experience in the wrestling business as it relates to what goes on in a ring, right? It's another thing altogether to have experience as it relates to the wrestling business outside of the ring, the business of the wrestling business. And I think it was a reflection of how little experience or understanding that the people involved had at the time. Because while it may have been a cute little inside joke, TNA, which the acronym here, stands for tits and ass, which was the Vince Russo kind of approach to creative. Vince Russo liked to do It's like if Howard Stern, the shock jock, was writing wrestling, it would be all over the top, salacious, gratuitous, stupid shit. And that's what Vince Russo was all about at that point. So the TNA, it was just like, it was a reflection of ignorance. It was a reflection of ignorance and inexperience, in my opinion. Still is.
With Jim Cornette gave an interview, or maybe on his podcast many years ago, and he said that he used to have to sell advertising and sell spots of advertising on the show. And he'd twist and chew his face up to do whatever he could to not say the words TNA. Because as soon as he said, our company is TNA, and it's such a turn off for sponsors as well.
Yeah, it's a reflection of ignorance, and ignorance in a literal sense. Not to cut somebody down, but the definition of ignorance is lack of information or knowledge, and that was a reflection of ignorance.
Six-sided ring as well. I believe you were a proponent of just getting rid of it as quickly as possible and just going to the traditional.
I was the loudest voice in the room. It was stupid. And again, that sounds harsh, but it was a reflection of ignorance, just like the TNA name. To think that you're just going to put a six-sided ring on television and that in and of itself would create a brand identity. That's like 14, 15-year-old kids sitting around a room spitballing ideas. That's how stupid that was. Now, if the six-sided ring would have changed the actual presentation, meaning wrestlers would change the way they performed inside of the ring to take advantage of the six-sided ring, or if the six-sided ring were somehow to become more inherently dangerous, where the stakes were raised because of this six-sided ring and the implications of it, then I could get behind it. But it was just, we're going to put up a six-sided ring. And the action in the ring remained exactly the same. How in the world is that going to make any kind of a statement?
They were trying to...
it's like, let's just hang a raw chicken from the ceiling and see if that works.
AWA, they did it, didn't they? Was it
yeah,
Jake
well, they
the
put it on a poll.
Mill
Yeah, they put it on a poll.
Man, I can't believe Russo
never
put that on a poll.
Turkey on a pole, man.
With the ring as well, I'm gonna say something. You tell me if I'm off base or not. As a kid, I remember watching, let's say 90, probably when I was watching WCW, it was 98, and WWF at the same time. But I was used to WWF presentation before WCW, and the WWF had a 20x20 ring. WCW had an 18x18 ring. TNA had I think it was an 18x18 ring as well. In my young brain, I always associated the 20x20 as the standard, and I always wondered why WCW and TNA always went for a smaller ring.
I think TNA probably bought old WCW rings. No, I'm not joking. I think that's probably the answer. And I could be wrong in that. I'm just taking a guess, but I would not be surprised if that was the case. I'm not sure why WCW, used the 18x18 ring. It was there when I got there. It was a decision, and I inherited it. And I didn't really think about making a change until towards the very end, because the 20x20 ring, and it doesn't seem like it would make that much difference, right? 18x18 versus 20x20, it's 2 feet. What the hell? Who cares? But the action in the ring in a 20x20 ring can become faster because you've got more room to work. You've got a longer distance to cover across the ring, which creates a visual impact that's different than taking 6 quick little short steps and then you're making contact. So yeah, I think the 20x20 ring was an advantage in many respects in terms of the actual presentation, especially when you had in a tag team match or a 6-man match, or God forbid you had a lumberjack match. I mean, it's just like, oh my gosh, or a battle royal inside of an 18x18 ring. It looked like a bunch of guys fighting in a phone booth.
In fact, that was actually the point I was going to bring up as well. Is it was markedly more obvious when, like, let's say, the Giant or Kevin Nash was in the WCW ring, and it made it seem so much smaller. Whereas in 20x20, it doesn't, which sounds so weird that 2 feet makes all the difference.
It really, really does. And there's an example of how a ring actually changes presentation, right? As opposed to the six-sided ring, which didn't change anything.
We'll go back to TNA then, and you mentioned Dixie Carter, her relationship with everybody in the office and Vince Russo in particular. Why did Dixie Carter always have a soft spot for Vince Russo as a writer, to the point where she surreptitiously hired him after he was fired and still took advice from him in that sense?
I don't know. I can't explain it. I mean, I can understand why early on, because, Dixie had no experience in wrestling. I'm not even sure she was all that familiar with professional wrestling before she ended up owning the company. And the natural tendency is to kind of surround yourself with people who have had some track record in the business, right? That's not unusual. But, Vince is uniquely charming. Vince can be a very sympathetic character. And he's a very charming guy. He's got a lot of charisma, and he's good at convincing people of things. He's good at convincing himself of things as well. But so I can't be too critical of Dixie for buying into Vince Russo initially. Why the hell she would have ever, as you put it, surreptitiously hired him and tried to keep that away from the network that specifically didn't want him to have anything to do with the program, I think was a self-inflicted wound that obviously TNA never got over. Once TNA in my opinion, Spike TV and Viacom decided they could no longer trust Dixie, that was the end of the road for TNA. That's what killed TNA more than anything, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Do you remember why Russo was told by USA to not be associated with TNA any longer? What was the one single idea or story that came up with that USA just said absolutely not?
My opinion.
Sorry, I'm saying Spike.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
USA, yeah. My opinion. I think I saw it as it was happening. We were in a venue. We were in an arena one day. We were on the road, and I saw Vince talking up in the stands. It was early in the day, so there's no people there. Up in the stands, he had cornered one of the Spike TV executives and was pleading his case and burying a lot of people in the process, from what I heard from that executive, who told me about it afterwards. And when that executive realized that a guy like Vince Russo was willing to throw his boss and a lot of other people under the bus to better his position, they made up their mind. Again, this is my opinion, that they made up their mind at that point in time that they didn't want to have anything to do with Vince Russo because he didn't have any integrity. They couldn't trust him. People don't realize, you've got to trust, your television partner, even though you may be getting a check from them every week and you're licensing your program to them, they are your partner. And if you don't treat them like a partner, it's not going to be a long relationship. And part of a good relationship with the network is trust. And they realized they couldn't trust Vince.
You mentioned in the book quite a number of times that when you were brought into TNA, it was essentially they wanted Hulk Hogan, and Hulk Hogan said, "I will not go to TNA without you." And there's misnomers out there, funny ideas of what you did and didn't do in TNA. And in the book, Grateful, you say that you were essentially a fixer of bad creative for Hulk Hogan. Do you remember any of the creative that Vince Russo or somebody else may have brought up for Hulk Hogan to do that you said absolutely not?
No, there really wasn't any, because when it came to Hulk's story, I was usually involved right from the get-go, and Russo and everybody else was pretty deferential. So there was never any, harebrained ideas that I had looked at and went, oh my gosh, are you people not, that never happened. It was actually a pretty smooth process in the very beginning.
Yeah, with Hulk Hogan, I always find that correct me if I'm wrong, his very last match on TNA was with Sting, and it was actually pretty good, even though he was hurting terribly and everything. All the emotion was there, and he just knew what to do at what time still. And I just find that he was a true worker can do that.
Yeah, and a lot of credit has to go to Sting as well. Sting, it's a dance, and Sting really, really did everything he could to make that match look as good as it could. Hulk was heavily medicated. He was in a lot of pain, but his life was in that ring. That's where Hulk felt the most comfortable because he was in control. Once he stepped out of that ring, he had no control over his life, especially at that period of time. People were coming at him from 100 different directions, going through the divorce and all the stuff that came with it. The issue that Hulk had with his son, Nick, and the pressure. Oh, yeah, that was another big thing that kind of led to that point in time when Hulk, unfortunately, said some things that made him look so bad. His son was in jail. His 16 or 17-year-old son was in isolation in jail. That will break an adult, and over time. But yet they had to keep Nick Hogan in isolation. Normally, the way they punish prisoners is putting him in isolation, but they had to put Nick in isolation because he was so young. They were afraid to put him in the general population. You think that wouldn't weigh on a father on top of everything else? But when Hulk was in the ring, that stuff was a distant thing. In that ring, he was in the moment, and in that moment, he was in control, and in that moment, he was Hulk Hogan, the character. And that's where Terry Bollea found the most comfort.
Did he get it out of his system after that last match, do you think? Or was he maybe planning for more, or his body wouldn't let him, or where do you think?
I think I think the desire to get back in the ring, the fantasy of it was still there. But the reality of it, he lived with that 24 hours a day, and he knew that it was never going to happen. He wanted it to, and he dreamt about it, and he talked about it. And he almost lived it vicariously through his conversations. But if it came down to putting on the boots, he knew he couldn't do it.
You're a promoter, or have been a promoter, and especially with WCW, I'm sure you learned many, many lessons. What could you have done to improve? I'll give you two questions, actually. One, to improve TNA's house show attendance, and two, were you one of the voices screaming at people to get the Impact tapings on the road instead of just in the same building every week?
Yes, I was. I was, again, one of the loudest voices in the room because I knew that if... Back up for a second. TNA as a company wanted to be more competitive than WWE. They weren't delusional. They didn't think that they were going to do what I did with WCW and beat WWE. That wasn't their goal. But their goal was to be much more competitive. They wanted more of a market share than they had when I got there. And that's one of the reasons why, even though I would have never associated myself with TNA had it not been for Hulk Hogan. But once I got there, it was one of the things that I went, okay, well, I'm going to do my best to make that happen. And it was so apparent to me because I had lived it, that if you wanted the audience to take you seriously as a wrestling company, you had to be in an arena. You had to have that audience. That audience is what gives you the credibility. The audience reaction is what sucks the television audience in and allows them to feel like they're there and engage and feel connected to what's going on the show. Putting it in a soundstage doesn't feel real. It's not the same thing. And can you imagine, a football game in the UK at a high school in front of 50 people? It doesn't feel the same.
Well, we went through with COVID, didn't we? I mean, NFL the same, football over here, no fans, and then they had the loop of fans screaming.
Yeah.
And there was someone, when a goal was scored, there was someone like 5 seconds behind pressing a button to cheer. It's not the same.
The audience won't engage. And I knew that because I used to produce shows in a soundstage. I did it because I was forced into it. I had to do it for economic reasons. But you can't get comfortable and think that that's going to work long term. And, TNA, they would bring, they brought in, before I even showed up, before Hulk Hogan showed up, they brought in Mick Foley, they brought in Cactus Jack, they brought in Dusty Rhodes, they brought in Christian, they brought in Booker T, they brought in Kurt Angle. They brought in a lot of top names, but it wouldn't matter because they're producing the show in their basement, and the audience is not going to take it seriously. they're not going to engage in the product. And the only way they would is to make a long-term commitment, not try it for 2 or 3 weeks and see if it's going to change the rating. That, again, is a very juvenile, naive, ignorant view of things. But if you go back and look at some of the attendance that TNA had when we did take the show on the road, pretty successful. The ratings went up in a pretty successful way. But they didn't go up enough so that the people that were financing TNA went, okay, well, we'll get a return on our investment next month. It's a long-term proposition. You look at what Tony Khan's done in 4 years. Tony Khan is just now getting to the point where you can take that product seriously if you're just an average wrestling fan. Now, if you're a hardcore wrestling fan and you live on the dirt sheets and you live on the internet, you just can't get enough of that wrestling drug, you're not the majority of the audience. You're the 2% or 10% of the audience. That 80 or 90% of the audience just watches because they want to kind of escape and live in this fanciful world, the fantasy world, live vicariously through the characters and get sucked into the show. Well, if you look at, for example, AEW last night, coming from Los Angeles, that had a big show feel to it. It felt really good as a television show. It's taken 4 years and a lot of money. Tony Khan, to his credit, Tony's willing to spend the money. TNA wasn't. TNA, if they spent the money today, they wanted to get a return on that investment 3 days from now. And that's not real.
Was that
especially when you're growing a wrestling company.
Was that more of a problem with the Carters, or was that more of a problem with Spike? Because I hadn't realized also there was
no, it's all Carter. Spike, and that's the other thing that used to irritate me about talking about TNA. Spike bent over backwards to make that franchise work. Kevin Kay and the people at Viacom spent millions of dollars trying to help TNA when TNA wouldn't spend their own money really without having hooks in it. They weren't willing to do what Viacom was willing to do for them. So they blew a great opportunity. TNA blew a great opportunity. They would still be around today if they would have listened and if they would have thought bigger.
With the contracts as well, I hadn't realised this because I'm not like a giant TNA fan or anything. I hadn't realised that Spike was picking up the contracts of some of the bigger names, Sting, Kurt Angle, some others. Was your contract Spike as well?
Yep.
So they really were fully invested then. How much of the company did they own? Or did they own any of it?
None. Zero. And if you go back and you look at, what was going on at Viacom at the time, and you remember UFC's reality show, The Ultimate Fighter, was on Spike TV. Spike TV and that show, Ultimate Fighter, is, I think, more responsible for the explosive growth and success of UFC than any other single move or single strategy. And Spike TV put a lot of time and money into that show. They promoted that show. Spike TV and their relationship and support of The Ultimate Fighter is one of the reasons that UFC became the success story that it did. I don't think anybody can argue that. And if they do, they're full of shit. So when UFC, when their contract was up, UFC said, oh, well, we're going to go shop our show. We're going to take it somewhere down the road, which is legitimate. That's business. But from Viacom's point of view, they went, okay, that's the end of that. We are never going to invest and use our television platform to build somebody else's company so they can take it down the street and compete with us. And that's when Viacom and Spike decided, if we're going to promote and present live action. At the time, they had Bellator. If you remember, Bellator was an upstart MMA company.
Well, they bought it as well at some point, didn't they? I believe.
For that very reason.
Exactly.
Viacom bought that because of the experience they had with UFC. And they went, well, I don't want to let that happen again. Let's own it. And when that decision was made, I was at TNA when that decision was made. And I had conversations with executives at Viacom. And I knew what their thought process was. So when I went back and I said, to some of the executives that I talked to at TNA, hey guys, you have a unique opportunity here. We have a difficult time with our funding partner, which is the Carter family. And not being critical of them. They had their goals and their reasons and whatever it is, but nonetheless, it was a problem. And if TNA wanted to go to the next level, they had to overcome that problem. So I went to them with the idea of let's go to Spike and let's make them either a part owner or an equal partner, because that will ensure your relationship with the television company. That will ensure your license fees. That will ensure growth, or at least indicate that, there's a reason to believe it'll continue to grow. But guess what, Bella? It's 2023. 10 years later, Scott Coker, who I've known since he was a kid, Scott Coker and Bellator are thriving because they made that move. In the inside of the offices of TNA, they looked at me like I had 3 heads because they didn't want to give up any control. Great. You have 100% of control over fucking nothing, as opposed to 50% control over something that can actually live well beyond all of us.
I'll ask you one more TNA-based question. I'll ask you a couple more questions, and then I will thank you so much for your time, because I don't want to. I'm very aware that I'm assaulting you with questions over 20 years.
That's all right, brother. I'm good.
One other thing I got from the book, Grateful, is that you've got an almost immeasurable sort of respect for Bruce Prichard, and I hadn't really realised how close you two were. Did that sort of relationship and trust build from when you were in WWE in 2002 onwards?
Yeah. But when I got to WWE, it was such a unique experience, because for so many years I was hated. I mean, people close to Vince, like, were really close to Vince, and and some of them I'm really good friend. Jerry Briscoe, by the way, who was very, very close to Vince back then, and went through a lot of the darkest periods of time, the drug trial and all of the really tough times,
the war room kind of years.
Yeah, Jerry Briscoe is right there, ready to do whatever he had to do for Vince McMahon. So, of course, Jerry Briscoe hated Eric Bischoff's guts because of the things that I did. I almost put him out of business. They were afraid they were going to lose their jobs and their livelihood because of me. And I was very vocal about it. I'd rub their nose in it. I'd make fun of them for it. So there was just a real palpable hatred towards me. And now here I am. I show up. I'm one of the central characters on TV, the quote unquote general manager. So when I showed up, everybody did their best to put their best foot forward and to be professional. But you could sense it was like, oh God, I can't believe I have to do this. I can't believe I have to say hello to this piece of shit. And Bruce was assigned to me as a producer. Bruce was my producer. So anything that I did on camera, Bruce would communicate it to me. He'd produce it. He'd direct it, whatever, backstage stuff. And almost immediately, Bruce was one of the only people that just said, that was then, this is now, let's move forward. And we just developed a great rapport as a talent and a producer. I knew what he was thinking. I knew what he wanted, and I was able to deliver it pretty consistently and make him look good as a result. And I think Bruce learned that, man, I was just fighting for my team. Yeah, I fought pretty dirty, because I do fight dirty when I decide to. I don't like to fight, but when I do, I fight to win. I'll avoid it at all costs. But once there's nowhere else to go, here I come. And that's the same way I approach business. I was fighting for my team. And Bruce, I think, recognized that and in his own way respected it. And that was the foundation upon which our relationship built and grew.
When you say agent, was he sort of helping you with your interviews and what you'd have to say as well? I mean, agent in what sort of sense?
Well, no, he was, WWE started calling agents producers a long time ago. Right. But when I use the term producer, I'm thinking about it in the traditional television sense. So, I would get a script. Bruce would get that script. There's a segment where I'm involved. If it was a backstage interview and involved 3 or 4 other people, Bruce would get everybody together. He'd get the right camera crew together, put the right audio team together, schedule everything, get all the talent involved, lay out that scene, promo, whatever you want to call it. He would lay out that segment so that we all knew what we were supposed to do. He'd make us run through it a couple times to make sure that it was exactly what he wanted or what Vince wanted. And and he'd produce it and he'd deliver it to Vince. He'd take that scene on tape to Vince, and then Vince would approve it. And then it would go to the truck. That was the process.
When he gets to when he gets to TNA and you're in TNA, I imagine it must have been so nice to have like a sympathetic ear to talk about all the backstage stuff of who, because also in the book you say some people should not have been in that office in TNA whatsoever. So was it nice to have Bruce there as someone who I imagine was quite like-minded and an ally of sorts?
It was just nice to work with somebody that knew the business as well or better than I did and operated on the highest levels, as opposed to, essentially now there were some talented people there. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to be overly critical or overly broad in my criticism. There were some very talented people. Not in the office. None of those people could hit their ass with both hands and a compass. But there were some good production people there. Kevin Sullivan, the producer, not the wrestler in Booker. Kevin Sullivan was very good. David Sahadi was very good. He had some real strengths, and there were others. But for the most part, they were all learning on the job and had no really understanding of the business or really any interest in it. It was like cosplay. Everybody would show up in the office and they had their roles and their titles, but they really had no understanding of the industry that they were in. But with Bruce, it was nice to have somebody that played at a higher level than I ever did to work with, because I just felt like we could achieve more. We could do better work together.
If I may, I'm going to ask a few WCW-based questions, and then I will thank you for your time. And this is sort of WCW. You probably answered this a million times, but I actually don't know the answer. Why were you not part of the invasion in 2001?
I was invited, but I turned it down.
Really?
Yep. Now, in fairness, Jim Ross called me in the very end of June or the first week in July, right before the 4th. In the States, 4th of July is a big holiday. It's also my wife's birthday. It's also when I have a family reunion, and friends and family come from all over the country to come in, because it's where I live, in a beautiful part of the country, and it's a lot of tourism, Yellowstone National Park and all that. So people come out, and every summer I would have a party that would celebrate my wife's birthday, the 4th of July. My father passed away on the 4th of July. So that's why we had the family reunion, to kind of remember my dad. And it was just an excuse, really. So all of that was going on. I had people coming in from all over the country. Some of them were driving their motorcycles here. Some of them were flying here. Some were driving here. And about 2 days before the 4th of July, I get a phone call from Jim Ross. Now, Jim and I didn't have a very good relationship at the time, because I think Jim blamed me for a lot of what happened to him in WCW. We've since, we're good friends now. But at that time, Jim Ross didn't have a lot of time for me. But Jim was the head of talent relations. So Jim Ross it was his job to call and try to get me to come in. And Jim, I could tell the minute I answered the phone that Jim didn't want to be on the other end of that phone. And I understood it. I didn't blame him, but it was what it was. When you're talking to somebody if they really want to talk to you or not, or if they're doing it because they have to. Jim was doing it because he had to. And I asked him, I said, first of all, it was short notice. Physically, I wasn't ready to be on TV. I'd probably put on 15 or 20 pounds. If I was going to be on TV, I would have liked a little bit more heads up so I could get myself in reasonable shape to be on television. And I had friends and family coming in from all over the country. What am I supposed to do? Say, hey, thanks for coming. Sorry, I couldn't be there. The timing was wrong. And additionally, Jim never told me what the angle was. And I asked him, I said, well, creatively, what are we talking about here? What would you like me to do? Because I was interested in the beginning. I probably would have, truth be known, if he said, look, we're going to have an invasion angle and here's what's going to happen. I probably would have apologized to my friends and family and done it, even though I was physically probably not ready to do it. I would have done it, but he didn't want to give me any creative. Oh man, the old man just wants you to come in. We'll sit down. We'll talk. You know, maybe it'll work. Maybe it won't. Maybe it's just a one night deal. I'm thinking, fuck, I'm not jumping on a plane, leaving all my friends and family here that have come in from all over the country, waddle my fat ass out on camera and embarrass myself for a one shot. I'm not doing that. So I turned it down, which is why in 2002, Jim Ross didn't call me. Vince McMahon did.
I was going to say, I put on £15 over Christmas as well. That's what I was worried about this interview, because thankfully it came a bit earlier. I've just bought one of those air bikes, you know, one of them CrossFit air bike things. So I thought you'd like to know that. In 2002, why were you brought in as Vince McMahon's ally and not with all... that's probably the feud people would have bought more than any other at that time, is you versus McMahon. So why were you sort of brought in as an ally straight away?
How would you explain that, though? I mean, logically, everybody knew that Vince McMahon was the chairman of the board. He was running the show. Who could have, and I'm not saying it couldn't have been done, you could have created a story where Shane McMahon brought me in and suggest that Shane McMahon or Stephanie McMahon had the authority to make that move. But it would have been hard for most people to believe. You know, storylines, for them to be effective, have to at least be plausible. Everybody knows that it's scripted entertainment, but if a story starts off as just not being plausible, it's really hard to make it work. Whereas Vince bringing me in was shocking and it was plausible. It would have been better had I turned on Vince or somehow tried to take over or fulfill my own goals at Vince's expense so that we were in an adversarial position. That probably would have been better, but it still worked out pretty good. I mean, I was in that role for 3 or 4 years. I thought it maybe would last a year at the most. I never expected to be there as long as I was.
And something I learned from Grateful, the book as well, your second biography, is that I didn't realize you were contracted until, what, 2007?
6 or 7, yeah.
Yeah. A couple more questions, and one that's... This isn't the one, but I've saved the best for last, in my opinion, is WCW's list of innovations. Pay-per-view numbers, by numbers I mean frequency per year. Prices going up, I believe, before the WWF did, and it didn't affect buys. Going 2 hours instead of 1, presenting big matches every week. What innovations that you came up with, or WCW as a whole came up with, that the WWF then stole, are you most proud of, or that you think people might not know about?
Well, I think there's a lot of them. You know, I think the most important one, and I think the reason that we're talking about WWE today and being acquired by Fox or Comcast or the Saudis or any number of other, major corporations, you're talking about a company today that has a $6.6 billion market valuation. And a lot of the reason for that was born out of the Monday Night Wars. The biggest of them all, and the reason AEW exists today, is because I was the first one and the only one to go to a live weekly format. And by becoming a live action weekly show, not occasionally, not every other week, but live every single week, is the reason, one of the reasons, that WWE and AEW are in the position they're in today. Because there is other than traditional sport and news, nothing is live except for wrestling. And I did that. I forced Vince to do that. Vince didn't want to do that because going live every week is expensive, very expensive. And it doubles your cost of your production, actually. And I forced Vince in order for Vince to keep up with me, I forced him to go live every week. And that one move is probably more responsible for the success of this industry today than anything else I did. But in addition to that, the reality-based characters and storylines. If you go back and look at WWE storylines in 1995 and the characters in 1994, 1995, when 1995 is when Nitro launched, characters were animated, cartoonish, and they were really designed for teens and preteens because that was their market. That was the business model of WWE. I forced WWE to adapt an 18 to 39 or an 18 to 49 presentation. And it took them about a year to do it. You can go back and look because it's all available. You can go back and look, go back and look at the first time Vince McMahon shows up wearing a black jean jacket instead of a stuffed three-piece suit. Go back and look at that. Go back and look at the first time Vince McMahon acknowledges being the guy that's running the company. It happened a year after I was doing it, along with the jean jacket. Go back and look. In fact, it happened in November of 1997 when Vince McMahon cut an interview where he said, we're going to change the way we present this product. We're no longer going to insult the intelligence of our viewers. That was Vince McMahon saying, we're going to go do what these guys are doing because this NWO stuff is kicking our ass. So we're going to come up with our own version, which is, by the way, what do they call it? Generation X. That was their version of NWO.
They even stole the suck it thing. NWO was doing that long before.
Yeah. I mean, all of that was a reaction to what we had been doing that allowed us to defeat WWE in head-to-head competition for almost 2 years. The cruiserweight division. You look at AEW today, entire show's a cruiserweight division. I was the first person that not only brought in, because other people had done it. Paul Heyman did it in ECW, but nobody saw it. It's kind of a secret because nobody watched that show. But to bring in to create a division specifically for guys that were under 200 pounds, because that style of wrestling, that luchador style of wrestling, and let's talk about that. Yes, luchadors had been, again, Paul Heyman had a couple in there. But I was the first one to bring that luchador style of wrestling to prime time on a major platform in the United States. And guess what? It's still here today. Mm-hmm. Guys like Rey Mysterio Jr. have had amazing careers. His son is having an amazing career, all because of what I did. I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back, but you go back and look at the facts in the timelines. Going live, more reality-based television and storylines, bringing in the luchadors. You talked about presenting main event level, pay-per-view level matches on a weekly basis. All of that stuff is considered to be, that's just what we do in wrestling today. But it wasn't until I did it. And that's what, I take a lot of comfort in. I don't worry about, people patting me on the back or telling me how great I am, because I know what I did. I know what I did. I don't need people to tell me.
I will limit myself to 2 more questions, and you can be as quick or as detailed as you like it to be. The NWO, I asked this Kevin Sullivan when he interviewed him a couple of months ago. He gave me 6 names. With the NWO, if you could redo it, who should the members have been limited to?
Hulk, Scott, Kevin, Six, Conan. Where am I at? How many is that?
5. You don't have to limit yourself to 6, but is that 5?
Then me 5 or 6. Yeah, I throw myself in there as the spokesperson. But as a talent, if there was one more, probably Scott Steiner.
And is this an appropriate time to pay tribute to the true inventor of the NWO, Greg Gagne and Mike Graham?
Greg Gagne is a sad, sad human being. I mean, it's funny how many people take credit for the NWO. Nobody fucking knew what the NWO was until Hulk Hogan came out and said it. Scott and Kevin didn't even know the third man was going to be Hulk Hogan until shortly before. Not that day. They knew before that day, but it might have been, they didn't know until a couple of days before. Nobody knew. I didn't tell anybody. I didn't get the idea from anybody, and I didn't tell anybody anything, but yet people are crawling out of the woodwork taking credit for the NWO because they need to. A guy like Greg Gagne, I'm not going to say anything about Mike Graham. Mike Graham's, he's not here to defend himself, but it is what it is. Mike Graham was an emotionally disturbed alcoholic. And usually emotionally disturbed alcoholics, you've got to take whatever they say with a grain of salt. I'm going to let it go at that. I said more than I wanted to. Greg Gagne, on the other hand, is a failed second generation entitled ex-wrestler who felt because he was Greg Gagne's kid, Vern Gagne's kid, he should have had my job. He should have been more important in the industry. He should have been Vince McMahon's right-hand man because Greg grew up being entitled. He was a scrawny, somewhat athletic, but not a credible character as far as professional wrestling is concerned in that era. He looked more like a golfer than he did a professional wrestler. And everybody knew that the only reason he was getting the push he was getting is because he was Vern Gagne's son. Well, when AWA went away and this guy who used to work for AWA, this kid that came in with no experience at all, who worked for Vern Gagne, all of a sudden ascended up the ranks and not only was in control of WCW, but created one of the only company so far in history that's been able to outperform WWE and beat Vince McMahon at what Vince McMahon does best, was the guy that used to work for him. And it was hard for Greg to deal with that because he had this sense of entitlement. And ultimately I had to fire Greg because his sense of entitlement got the best of him. And to this day, he's still taking credit for a lot of things that he should probably not take credit for. But, he's old. He's, led a somewhat miserable life since AWA collapsed. He's never been really good at anything other than being Vern Gagne's son. So, it is what it is.
Was one of the other things that he may have taken credit for bringing Hulk Hogan into WCW by any chance?
Of course he did. Of course he did. And one of the biggest challenges I had with Hulk Hogan initially is Greg Gagne, because really? Hulk didn't trust Greg. Hulk wanted to make sure Greg Gagne was as far away from anything that Hulk Hogan did creatively as he possibly could. It was a legitimate concern for Hulk because he just did not trust Greg and didn't think Greg had anything to offer.
I've got one more question for you. And it's one that I've wanted to know for 20 years. I'm so happy I get to ask it you now. I got the Monday Night Wars DVD back in 2004, and I'm sure you'll agree it's a very condensed and sort of WWE-centric version of the Monday Night Wars. But one quote you give on the interview is that you said, by August of 1998, I knew WCW was over, but when we were still rolling. But by August 1998, you knew that WCW was doomed. What happened in August 1998 to sort of lead you down that thought process?
It wasn't one thing. It was a combination of things that all happened in a very short period of time that summer. And one of them I don't have time to go into because it's a very complex story. But to summarize it, I got called to a meeting one morning. Now keep in mind, context is king, right? WCW is still outperforming WWE. We're still kicking it, right? They're coming up. They're getting closer, but we're still doing great. We're making money hand over fist. We're exceeding our projections for the year financially. Ratings are solid. Everything's great. I get called to a meeting, and I show up in that meeting, and there are 12 or 14 people sitting around a long conference table. Only 2 or 3 of them I even recognized. I didn't even know who they were. And they each went around the room, went around the table, and shared with me what they thought I should be doing with WCW to improve it. We got down to the end of the table, This guy, his name was Joe. He was the president of Turner Ad Sales. He stood up, or he didn't stand up. He sat there and he said, you need to start producing your show for children and families. This show has to be comfortable for advertisers who are advertising to teens and preteens. Just like I forced WWF to stop doing it. Because while they were doing that and I was doing what I was doing, I was kicking their ass financially, ratings wise, in every respect. Now I have somebody who's in charge of ad sales for Turner Broadcasting telling me I have to abandon the very formula that got us to the dance and put us in the number one position on television. I needed to abandon that and go back to doing what my competitor was doing while I was kicking their ass. And I said, that's insane. That makes no sense. And I asked this individual. Now, this was a trick question. And keep in mind, I was defensive. I was sitting there with a bunch of people I didn't fucking know. And I didn't pay attention to their titles. I didn't care who they were. These people who knew nothing about my business, who knew nothing about how I got to be number one, who knew nothing about the audience, are now telling me how to run my business. And I left that meeting and I went home and I told my wife, I said, I'm going to quit. I'm going to turn in my resignation. This is fucked up. And all this, by the way, is a result of the AOL Time Warner merger. So I was ready to resign, but it kind of goes against my nature. And I was still very loyal to Ted. I'm thinking, who are these jackasses who don't know anything about my business or the industry in general or the audience that comes with it? They're telling me what I should be doing with my business. I'm going to go to Ted. Well, little did I know that as a result of that merger, Ted didn't have any more power than I did. And these people were this was a little bit of a palace coup. And if you read Ted Turner's book, I can't remember the name of it, but there's a book that Ted Turner wrote that talks about this period of time. Ted Turner didn't realize that he was losing control of his own company. And he didn't realize it until it was over. And he realized one morning he got to his office and he was just a figurehead who didn't get to vote on anything.
3% of the voting shares or something like that, didn't it? Or 3% of the company,
he no longer had control of his own company. But I didn't know it. Just like Ted didn't know it until after it was over. I didn't know it at all. So I'm thinking these jackasses are just going to be another speed bump in my way. I'm going to go to Ted. I'm going to make this all go away. But the problem is I never got to get to Ted. If I would have known that Ted wasn't there and Ted no longer had control, I would have resigned. Absolutely would have resigned because it made no sense. And I knew it wasn't going to work. So when people talk about, the reason WCW failed is because of the finger poke at Doom, or the reason WCW failed is because Sting should have beat Hulk Hogan and there should have been a fast cut. It's like you fucking people are like children. You know nothing about the business side of the business because they weren't in those meetings. They weren't exposed to the things that I was exposed to at a very, very high corporate level. They weren't there in 1998 when my budget that had already been approved in 1997 was cut in half. They weren't there. They didn't understand. They didn't know that. So all these, the clowns that, were in the ring that didn't understand how the circus really worked, were the ones that were, they're out there talking about what went wrong with WCW. Now, dudes, you're a clown, you're a performer. And by a clown, I don't mean that to, as a shot, but I'm comparing it to the circus. The clowns in the circus don't necessarily understand how the circus operates as a business. They're just there to be good clowns.
So when in early 1999...
That's going to get a lot of heat, by the way. If you clip that and put that out on social media, that's going to get a lot of traction.
Hopefully so. Hopefully we'll sell some more books as well. I was just going to briefly ask as well, in 1999, early 1999, is it you that holds a talent meeting and says, look, we can't do all the swearing anymore and gesticulating at one's own crotch and that kind of thing? Was that from above that you had to say that at that point?
That came out of that meeting. Yep, Terry Tingle. There's a lady by the name of Terry Tingle. It's the best stripper name I've ever heard, or porn name. Can you imagine being a porn star named Terry Tingle? Like, my God, you'd be making millions. Terry Tingle, but that was her legit name, Terry Tingle. She was the head of standards and practices, and she gave me a list of all the things that we could no longer do because Joe Yuva wanted us to be a kid friendly show.
And international objects and foreign objects. That was way before, I know that, but man, that was always one that always stunned me as a kid. What's an international object?
Yeah, well, that was a Ted Turner thing, by the way.
Yeah.
Ted hated the word foreign. Like, he thought it was a derisive term. You know, calling somebody a foreigner is an insult. So we weren't allowed to use the word foreigner. It had to be international. Like, if I walked into Ted's office and said, "Hey, Ted, I got a deal to do some foreign television distribution," no, I'd have been shown the door. That's where that came from.
Eric, to be honest, I've just looked at the clock here. We've gone not too far away from 2 hours now. I want to thank you so much for your time. I always find with wrestling, the most interesting bits of wrestling is not the behind the scenes between the wrestlers. It is how a TV product sort of ends up at the end stage there. And I love the minutiae of the business and that kind of thing. So it's been and I never swear on these things because occasionally my mother listens. So cover your ears, Mum. It's been a fucking delight having you on, brother. Let me tell you.
Thank you,
just before I let you go, do you want to hit me some plugs? Of course, Grateful, the book. Where can people find it?
Yeah, I mean, you can get it on Amazon. The links are available for the UK. I don't have them off the top of my head, but I'm sure you can find them put them up there in a graphic.
They're in the descriptions.
But it's available.
They're in the descriptions, everybody.
Great. So take a look at that. It was a fun book. I don't want to say I was hesitant, but I didn't really think that I had another book in me. But Guy Evans, who is a phenomenal writer and a good friend, really did a great job of capturing my thoughts and stringing it all together in a format that I'm very proud of. Do I talk about wrestling in the book? Of course I talk about wrestling because for the last 15 years, I've still been involved in it up until recently. But it's really not about wrestling as much as it's about just this journey I've been on to learn how to appreciate things and be grateful for them. And the impact, once I started really focusing on being grateful, and not for the big things, man. It starts with little things. It's like going to the gym and working out. You don't start out by throwing around tons of weight and pushing yourself physically. You start out doing little things and gradually building up. And that's kind of been my journey with learning how to be grateful. Recognizing that when I get up in the morning and I open my eyes and everything still works. I have no pain. I have no disease. I have no injuries. I have no nagging anything. I feel better physically now than at 67 years old than I did when I was 37, believe it or not. And part of it is because I take better care of myself and I'm paying more attention as I get older.
You don't have the weight of the world on you either as well, I suppose.
Yeah, and when you're younger, you're invincible, right? Nothing's ever going to happen to me. I was very physical. I was athletic. I was competitive. I was a kickboxer. I wrestled in high school and college. I did Golden Gloves boxing. I loved to run. I was always very physical. And I don't want to call myself an athlete because I was never really all that good at any of it, but I loved doing it. I did it consistently through the majority of my life up until my early 30s, mid 30s. So I never thought about things like that. But now I've learned it. When I wake up and I feel good and I'm healthy, I'm grateful for that. When I walk outside, and I live in a beautiful part of the world, but when I walk outside with my dog on a summer morning at 6 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock in the morning, and I watch the sunrise in the mountains, and that's when I talk to God. That's my prayer time. I'm not I don't go to church. I'm not a big fan of structured religion, but I'm very spiritual. And when I get to be outside and talk to God, I'm grateful for that. And when I'm done, I feel different than I've ever felt in my life. And I'm grateful for my children who are healthy and successful, and are more important than that, they're really good people, like really, really good people that I'm so proud of. The way they treat other people, the way they treat each other and their friends and their relationships. Very proud of them. And obviously the financial success that I've had. I've had some tough times. You know, I say in the book, man, I've bounced off the bottom a lot. Never spent any time on the bottom, but I bounced off of it a lot. But I've learned to be grateful for those experiences because I've learned so much from them. And I don't look at them as failures anymore or shortcomings. I look at them as lessons that I've learned from to help me go on. You know, I went from being bankrupt 3 or 4 years ago to having a net worth in the 7 figures. That's kind of hard to do, especially when you're reinventing yourself when you're in your mid-60s. But I was able to do that, and I'm grateful for that. But the reason I was able to do it is because I've learned how to become grateful, and I've learned that discipline, and I practice it. I try to practice it every day. Sometimes I don't. Just like working out, man. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I am a lot, sometimes I forget. But overall, I've learned that gratitude and really becoming grateful for the little things in your life and building upon them is probably one of the most valuable lessons I've ever learned in my life. And that's what I talk about in the book.
Yeah. With Grateful as well, once again, the links are in the description. I encourage you to get it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I devoured it in one day next to the fire when we were snowed in that cabin in Norway, man. So it's a picturesque place to read it. I could have...
You're lucky. You could have been reading it in jail.
He's right as well, let me tell you. He's absolutely right. I had so many questions for you. We could have had a sequel called 84 Weeks. I wanted to ask you about how you got David Hasselhoff's license for the gaming and stuff like that. But I know that most people want to hear about the wrestling stories. But there's so much out there in the book as well. From Hulk Hogan's celebrity wrestling. There was the Buffalo Bill Cody beer that we didn't even get chatting to. But read the book. I encourage you to get the book and read the book and find the whole sort of story that ends up just being a bit of a nightmare with the licensing deals and everything. But for now, thank you so much for watching. We will catch you again. Well, I will catch you again next time. Thank you, Eric, for entertaining us for so long.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate it. I love doing the show with you, and hit me up again down the road. We'll do another chapter.
I've got that recorded. Just so you know.
You do.
I've got that recorded, so we'll have it. Right. Thank you very much.
All right, buddy. Be well.